Good to see everybody out this morning. Ben, we're glad you're back. We've missed that chair kind of being empty there. We really missed Jen, but we're glad you're back, and we hope that means you're feeling better. You know, you created a little bit of a problem for us. We're putting money in the money jar, hoping you would be better and you'd be back, but usually it was with the disclaimer, if Ben would wait another week, you know, Kathy would come back with us again. But we're glad you're back. And Jim, we're glad you're here today. I saw that fancy walking device out there. Could you have made that Auburn sign any bigger? Well, somebody has to do that. Did you see that, Billy? You know, it'd have been an awful trick to pull on somebody to put a big UT cushion in that, wouldn't it? Yes, Nick's got one that he'd volunteer. I was driving out by the National Cemetery yesterday, and there must have been 200 Boy Scouts up there putting flags out on the graves up there. And I thought that was a wonderful thing to do, especially when you think about how every one of those flags and every one of those markers recalls the life of somebody who gave something extraordinary and special to our country so we can come and do something like be in church today. So I do think that is, as Charles said, it's very important for us to remember this weekend and the lives of the people who have given their all for our country. You couldn't hardly help but think that you really hoped that because of the graves that were being decorated, that those grave decorators might not ever have to deal with some of the things that those people did. So we appreciate everybody in this class that has served our country in the military, and that is several people. And we appreciate very deeply the sacrifices that you've made to allow us to be here today. So let us remember across this weekend that this is Memorial Day. You know, sometimes when you do kind of what I do, you talk to people, and sometimes it's at a break in the program, and sometimes it's when the program is over. And I've always felt like that some of the very, very, very best comment that you hear come at halftime or come after the program is over. And so last week, whenever I finished and we were getting ready to leave, I was met down here by Al Bowles, and that's always a pleasure. I don't have to go on. Al knows how I admire him. But Al began to talk, and Al talked about this situation that Chris made us aware of last week of this young boy at Tyner High School who evidently is a wonderful young man, a great basketball player. From everything that I've seen about him, people just love to have him around. But like so many kids in the inner city of Chattanooga, his father's in prison, his mother had been murdered. There wasn't enough money to bury him, and so Chris helped us last week contribute to being able to help make that possible. But when Al came up and talked, Al talked about his daughter asking him to come and to serve in some kind of a counseling role or a speaking role to try to bring some kind of comfort to those people's lives at Tyner. And Al asked me a question. He said, have you ever had a situation where you just didn't know what to say? Or a situation in which there just wasn't anything you could say? And what do you do in that kind of a situation? I think every one of us have experienced that. Every one of us have experienced situations when we've tried to relate to the grief or the loss or the trouble of somebody that may be a very dear person, and we get up against that situation, and people expect us to be able to say something or to be able to know what to say, and the situation can be so overwhelming or so daunting that there is just nothing that we can say. And so I've thought, Al, about that all week long. I mean, I've thought about that all week long. And I think that Al is exactly right, that there's some times in which even people that are very eloquent and people that are very well trained and people that have spent their lives knowing what to say confront a situation in life in which you just don't know what to do. But then, of course, I've always found Al to be the kind of person that knows the right thing to do. And so he went on to explain that in that situation, he didn't just jump up and start saying something. He didn't jump in and just start playing his role. But he stopped and he waited for a few moments and at least took the time to go and talk to the principal or talk to some of the other people that were there and that were in charge about exactly what might need to be done. I think that things would have been fine, Al, if you had just got up and done your wonderful thing. But I think that because you acknowledged that you were in a situation that you weren't quite ready for and you waited, I think that is a profoundly important kind of thought that we ought to have about our lives and something that we ought to be better at practicing in our lives than we sometimes are. And so, Al, I've thought about what you had to say all week long.
Steve, can I interject?
You sure can.
Well, Dawn was able, with the help of our class and others, to raise the money they needed for the burial and to give the grandmother $3,000.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So,
Yeah, that is truly wonderful.
This class, we raised 450, I mean 550, they said, and I'm sure thank you for that.
Well, that's wonderful. That's the way things ought to work. When I thought about Al all week, I thought about Job. I don't always associate Al with Job, but I thought about Job all week. And we know that story pretty well. We know that Job was a good man and a decent man, a man that was beloved by God. We know that Job was a man who had had all kinds of wonderful things happen to him. He had had a wonderful big family, which would have been seen as a blessing in that Jewish culture. He had achieved all kinds of property and all kinds of animals and crops, and so he had achieved all kind of wealth. And so Job was someone who was living the life that a decent and an honorable man ought to have been living. And then, of course, we know from the story of Job that everything just came apart and that he lost everything that he had. And so we have the story of a man who is trying to understand where this loss comes from and trying to figure out a way to live beyond it. But the part of the story that sometimes escapes our notice that I think is very pertinent to what we're trying to talk about today is that very on in the book of Job, we have three people that are identified as Job's friends. And there's nothing in the Bible whatsoever that would indicate that there's anything phony or there's anything that's out of sync, that these are people that are genuinely friends of Job. They're the kind of friends that when they begin to hear about what all has happened to Job, that they are saddened and that they want to figure out some way to be responsible to that. And so in the second chapter of Job, it says that these people make an appointment. The Bible would let us know that that was some kind of a special kind of an arrangement that they made. In all likelihood, these were people that lived at some distance, and so they communicated back and forth with each other, and they made an arrangement that they would meet at a certain particular time and they would come together to help Job. The Bible tells us there that they came with the very specific intent of bringing comfort to Job. I don't think they knew how bad things really were. I don't think they knew what they were getting into. But I think that their intentions of friendship for them were very legitimate. They had come to comfort Job. And then the Bible tells us that when they approached Job from a distance, that they did not recognize him. That the pain of what had happened to him and the terrible grief that was going on relative to his life, that every bit of sadness and hurt that he had experienced was now being expressed in his body to the point that they don't even recognize Job. And I think that when they finally actually do, that they realize the depth of the circumstance that they've gotten themselves into. The Bible says that they are such friends of Job that they begin to weep, that they are such friends of Job that in a symbolic kind of a gesture of support, they begin to tear their clothes apart. The Bible tells us that they begin to take dirt and dust and pour it on their own heads and on their own bodies. So maybe even in their appearance that they're constructing, that they're showing some sympathy for Job. And the Bible says that for 7 days and for 7 nights they sit with their friends. I talked to somebody the day before yesterday that had sat all night with someone in their family in a hospital. And they were just totally worn out. And you've had to do that sometimes. And so here we see these men sit with Job for 7 days and 7 nights. But then the Bible tells us then. And the Bible strikes out for us that now there's a change that's about to occur. And the Bible says, then Eliphaz the Temanite, one of Job's friends, decided that he couldn't sit there any longer. He called an end to his waiting. And here's what he said. If one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? Now, you know exactly what comes after phrases like that. Somebody's getting ready to have something said that's offensive. Do you mind if I tell you something about you that I really don't want to hurt your feelings? Well, more than likely, somebody's getting ready to hurt your feelings. And so Eliphaz says, if someone ventures a word with you, will you be offended? And then he says, yet who can keep from speaking? Well, anybody can keep from speaking if they choose not to speak. Anybody can keep from speaking if, like Al, they just kind of put it on hold for a moment. Anybody can keep from speaking. And so you know that Eliphaz the Temanite is getting ready to speak. And then he says, think now. It's as if we're going to bring some logic to this equation. We're going to bring some rationality to this situation. Let's get beyond all this grieving that we're doing and let's start thinking this thing through. Let's start thinking about what's going on here. And I submit to you that sometimes the worst thing we can do is to start thinking about something, and that sometimes thinking can have a way of messing something up as quickly as it can of fixing it. But he says, think now. Who has ever been innocent that has not persisted? He says, who has ever been innocent and escaped being perished or being persecuted? You hear what that's saying? He's saying that when I think about it, he says, I don't know anybody that was truly innocent that suddenly was being punished. He said, when you think about it, I don't know anybody that was really had a clean slate in their life that began to have troubles. He says, when you think about it, there must be more going on here than meets the eye. He says, or when are the upright cut off? And he's kind of answering his own question. Truly upright people aren't cut off, Job. You understand that in your thinking. And he says, as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Everybody needs a friend like that. Here his buddy Job is in the worst circumstance of his life. And he comes, and we'll give him credit for that. And he mourns and weeps, and we'll give him credit for that. And he sits there for 7 days and 7 nights, not opening his mouth, and we'll give him credit there. But somewhere we understand from the text that along that way, he begins to make an assumption. And that assumption is that nobody could be having all these troubles unless they'd done something really wrong. He begins to make the assumption, and it works out in the text, that what Job really needs to do is to confess to these guys what it is that he's actually done so badly. That would probably make a good story for the evening news. And then seek God's forgiveness. And he advances those assumptions, and he advances those expectations into the conversation. And all that he ends up doing is making things worse than they already were. All that he ends up doing is making Job's life even more complicated and more painful than it already was. We've all done that, haven't we? We've all spoken too quickly. We've not taken the Al Bowles route and just said, I don't know what to say here. I got to figure out a little bit more. And sometimes when we've spoken from the place of where we insert our assumptions, and sometimes when we've spoken from the place where we insert our expectations and interpretations on other people's lives and how they should be, sometimes we make circumstances even worse. Maybe we need to learn better how to be quiet and how to wait. There is a woman by the name of Fran Lebowitz that I'll bet some of you all have come across at some time. She's a very funny, kind of an acute woman in her sensibilities about the world that we live in. But one time I heard Fran Lebowitz say this, and I thought about it especially this week out. Fran Lebowitz says, what we've got to understand that the opposite of speaking is not listening. That the opposite of speaking is waiting until we legitimately do have something to say that matters, or until we legitimately do have something that will allow us to make a difference in a positive way. I saw a movie not long ago, and I'm really surprised at myself that I sat through that whole movie, to tell you the truth. Phyllis wanted to watch it, and she's a good cue about that kind of stuff, so that's part of the reason I tuned in. I also knew that that movie was going to take place in the 1950s in England, and it was supposedly going to have a lot of scenery from London and a lot of scenery from the English countryside. I love the English countryside, so I sat there thinking to myself, well, I'm going to watch this because at the very minimum, I'm going to get to see a bunch of pretty stuff. This movie, The Phantom Thread, starred a guy named Daniel Day-Lewis, who's a great actor. And in this particular movie, he played a dressmaker. And you see why I thought, well, I'll just go for the scenery? Because I had no interest in watching a movie about a guy who was a dressmaker, even if he was a dressmaker of an important house, and even if he was a dressmaker who made dresses for royalty. I couldn't see much future in a movie about dressmaking. But boy, did it end up being an interesting study. He was a perfectionist. And of course, that's what made him great. Every single solitary stitch had to be in exactly the right place. Everything had to fit perfectly. All of the people had to be on time for their work and work their full day and keep their noses to the grindstone, so to speak. And so everything had to be perfect in this man's life. And of course, because of his expectation of perfection, and because of his expectation and assumptions that everything was going to be exactly right and exactly measured, he was miserable. Because the dresses never lived up to perfection, and the people that they were put on were never structured perfectly. Something was always the matter that made it not be exactly right, and so he was miserable. His expectations, his assumptions made him miserable. And of course, in the story, he meets this young girl in a restaurant. She's a waitress, and he is really attracted to her. Not in the normal ways that we see attraction in most movies. He was attracted to her because his dressmaker's eye knew that her bodily shape was perfect. And he called his sister, his assistant, in, and they began to measure her, and every single one of her measures were perfect. He had found perfection. But oh Lord, was this girl anything but perfection. And when she started working on his mind and started working on him in some ways that I won't spoil for you, so if you watch the movie, she really turns this guy inside out and upside down. But in doing so, she allows him to see that maybe there is life beyond assumptions, and maybe there is life beyond expectations. And sometimes when we're forced to get into a situation where we have to be quiet, and sometimes when we are forced to get into a situation where we have to wait and we'd rather not wait in any lines, we can find out things about ourselves and we can come to insights that can make a great deal of difference. And finally, at the moment of change in this man's life, he says, you know, most of the heartaches of life occur whenever we let our assumptions and we let our expectations take over. He said most of the heartaches that we take to other people is when we see them only through the lenses of our assumptions and expectations. And most of the heartaches that we bring to ourselves are when we let the expectations and assumptions of others rule our lives. The Al Bowles way is better. We shut up and wait. The Al Bowles way is better. We don't just jump right into the middle of something and start running our mouths. We put a rein on ourselves and our expectations and our assumptions, and we respect the fact that sometimes life situations are bigger than what we think they should live up to. Joseph Campbell was a great writer. You may have read his book, Hero of a Thousand Faces, which is a powerfully wonderful book about the mythologies that have framed our lives. And Joseph Campbell said this one time. He said, a great deal about life is planning. And then he said, a great deal about life is living. And then he said that sometimes we let all of our planning get in the way of our living. And in that process, the planning of our expectations and assumptions keep us from experiencing life at its best and us at our best. A woman by the name of Karen Samuelson said it this way. She said, at the exit ramp of life, there are many wonderful things that can occur. But sometimes we're so busy going down the interstates that we don't even think about taking those exit ramps. When Phyllis and I first got married, we'd go to Florida every summer. Some of y'all did that. And usually the time was short, so boy, we'd get that car packed up, we'd get that car gassed up, and we'd take off as fast as the speed limit would go with nothing going to stop us anywhere along the way. We had every plan. I knew that right down near Cordele, Georgia, and I knew Cordele, Georgia because, Billy, that's where Malin Faircloth was from. Remember Malin Faircloth, boy? And we'd stop at Cordele because that's when we were about to run out of gas, and we'd get right back up on old Interstate 75, and we're headed in for the Florida line. That was our plan. We did that 3 or 4 times. And every time we got off, I looked over there in a field behind the gas stations, and there was an old airplane. Anybody remember that? And the old airplane had been turned into a restaurant. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea, but I got a plan. I thought it might be interesting to go in that airplane and see what they've done, but I've got a plan. And so while I'm sitting there filling up my gas tank as fast as the gas tank will fill up, a guy who has come from the south is doing the same thing. And he said, "Where are you headed?" I said, "Florida." He said, "There's about a 2-hour wait down there because of a wreck in about 5 miles. He said, "You need to find a different way, and there aren't many good ones around here." And so I said in some disgust to Phyllis, "Well, we're going to be stuck for 2 hours, and I'd rather not be stuck out there in the road. Why don't we just go over there to that airplane and see what that's like?" And 3.5 hours later, we were on our way to Florida again. Maybe not having had the greatest meal that's ever been fixed, but having the most enchanting evening with the people that had shown up in an airplane restaurant to eat, and the 2 old boys that sat up there with their instruments and played music for over 2 hours. And then guess what happened in the future? Our plans changed, and we stopped at the airplane. And then one day in a couple or 3 years, there was great disappointment because the airplane restaurant had closed. You get what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say we don't know how to slow down on the interstate. We don't know how to take the exit ramps where the wonderful things are. We don't know how to let our planning get out of the way of our living. We don't know how to get beyond making assumptions and expectations that sometimes when we run our mouths about them, we actually make things worse. We've got to learn the Al Bowles way. We've got to learn to realize that sometimes we just need to stop and realize not only we don't have anything to say maybe, but maybe we don't need to say anything until we wait a few minutes and get this thing figured out a little bit. I heard Bob Hope one time say that he really had appreciated all the compliments that people had given him about his dancing. And knowing that he had had no formal training, how had he ever learned to dance as well as he did? And Bob Hope said, "I had 6 siblings. We had 1 bathroom. While I was waiting at the bathroom, I learned how to dance." And we built houses with 4 of them, so we never have to wait. And because sometimes we never wait, we never dance. The 2 most heartbreaking moments for Jesus occur when he wept over Jerusalem and his expectations and assumptions about that triumphal entry ground into the dust. Or when he told those disciples that he was going deeper into the garden and he was going to pray, and they should wait and pray for him while he's there. And he came back and found them asleep. Even Jesus wasn't immune to assumptions and expectations. And it even brought sadness to his life. The book of Lamentations says, "It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." And the book of Isaiah says, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint. He does not grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength and mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Let us pray. Help us, O God, that we might somehow become more immune to the tendencies that we have to talk and to push forward with our assumptions and our expectations. Help us, O God, that we might realize that in our planning, in our racing to get from one place to the other, we do indeed miss exit ramps where there can be something wonderful. So help us that we might find ways to wait. Help us that we might control our passions for pushing forward beyond anything that looks like patience. And oh God, help us that in our learning to wait, that we might even learn to dance. Help us when to know when to speak. Help us when to know when to listen. Help us to know when to wait. Help us to know when to race forward. And help us to know when to slow down. And oh God, help us that we might have the right hopes and dreams. But help us to understand that our common assumptions and expectations stand the chance of not making circumstances better. We ask our prayer in Jesus' name to help us in this, which is very hard. Amen. Thank you all for coming. Glad you're back. Ben, we're delighted you're back. Have a good day of rest tomorrow, maybe. See you later.